And I think the issue is that isolating yourself so much can definitely cloud your judgment to where you don't even know what you want anymore. You don't even know what you want to experience because you're messed up on this idea that no one can give you kind of what you're looking for. And I think this is definitely something that a lot of people have and a lot of people are looked at because they don't realize that now they're hurting themselves. Now they're unable to have better relationships just because they feel like no one else will get them to that point. When you feel like no one else will be able to provide you with that feeling of peace or maybe even live up to the expectations you have, it's so much easier to isolate yourself, and to feel like people aren't going to kind of be there for you in a sense. And I think it's a definitely real feeling. I feel like now in this generation, so many people have this idea that they're kind of destined to be alone, that they won't ever have a relationship or won't ever have these things just because they're kind of experiencing so much hardships with companionship that they feel like they have to kind of be by themselves now. And I feel like as soon as you start to have this necessity, as soon as you start to have this like kind of very real feeling that no one will give you what you're looking for, I feel like it's so much easier to kind of get lost in that isolation, and I feel like when people are kind of building walls and kind of being very strict with who they allow in their life, they kind of box themselves in. They're now discouraging themselves and not really able to experience these natural, authentic feelings or even experiences just because they're so hard on themselves. Because you're so hard on yourself, now you can't experience real relationship, real connection, And I think that connection is definitely something that we're kind of losing now. The deeper connections in life, I feel like, aren't as common, when we're talking to people. I think there's definitely a lost art in that, in deeper connections below the surface and even in conversation. I feel like people aren't accurately trying to know other people anymore. And the issue with that is since we aren't knowing other people and we're only having these shallow conversations or only forming these temporary connections, we're not actively growing, and people should be growing. You should be looking back at yourself, years and years from now and realizing that you've changed, realizing that you've been able to persevere or that you'd handle things differently now is definitely a testament to that growth, and in order to grow, we have to have more productive relationships. We have to have more productive conversation and even connections. If we're only having these very temporary or very low level, shallow connections, then we're disregarding the fact that we can actively improve. We're kind of being disingenuous with ourselves. When people aren't looking to change or people aren't looking to kind of form something beyond themselves, they have to realize that they're doing themselves a disservice. You're not able to change who you are. You're not able to see anything new in your life because you're holding yourself back. And I think so many people are doing that to where it's just very negative. It's like I said, it's very easy to be pessimistic nowadays when we're talking about relationships, just because so many people are negative. So many people are very easy to kind of fall into these shallow connections or fall into this kind of very blanketed statement of, I'm never going to marry you or I'm going to die alone. And I think it's easy to fall into that, but it's definitely something that kind of will affect you long term, because I feel like as someone who's said that to themselves and as someone who's kind of had this idea that it will be impossible to form connections or it will be impossible to have this certain thing, it could definitely be something that affects you. Now your perception is definitely that other people will start to see. And I feel like not a lot of people are realizing that. The perception that we form of ourselves is the same perception that other people will actively look at. If you say that you're unlovable, if you say that you aren't deserving of a relationship or kind of you're a horrible partner, people will pick up on that. People will start to see that because you're actively putting it out into the world. As soon as you start taking the blame for everything or kind of constantly kind of being a people pleaser, you're now doing yourself a disservice. You're now giving other people the idea of maybe I'm actually not in the wrong, because they're apologizing. Now it means that I don't have to feel bad about this thing or that it's actually not my fault to feel bad about this thing, when we should be holding people accountable in our life. Despite how it makes other people feel, I feel like so many times when we are, being very quiet or walking on eggshells in other people's lives just because we kind of don't want to say how we feel, we are hurting ourselves more than anything. You're not able to kind of get anywhere if every time you're talking to people, you're just being very meek with it. You're being very shallow with it and not really saying how you feel. And I feel like when we are kind of holding back to spare other people's feelings, the feelings that are getting hurt in the end are ours. You can't expect anyone to kind of read your mind in that sense, or to say that they can understand how you feel, or anything like that. You're gonna hurt yourself. And I think a lot of people are doing that now, when they're assuming that people will kind of understand them, or people will kind of understand the overall feeling that they start to have. And I feel like that feeling is definitely something we should start to look at. It should be something we want to kind of achieve for the better. And instead of being very quiet, or stuck on it, or stubborn even, we're not looking for anything deeper than that. And I feel like when we aren't looking deeper in relationships, when we aren't looking deeper in connections, the solitude definitely returns. And I think that solitude is somewhere where a lot of people are kind of easily closeted, in a sense. You're very to yourself now, because you don't have the belief that people can appreciate you, that people can actually do something for you. And I think that belief is definitely something that's fallen off, even for me. That belief is very easy to be tainted when you've experienced so many bad relationships. When you've constantly had issues with people, to where you're unaware, and you're kind of feeling like things won't get better. It's harder to be positive about it. And I think if we want to have a better kind of isolated life, but still open to other people, we have to realize that we can be on our journey while still helping other people. And I think a lot of people kind of confuse themselves with that sense. When we're isolating ourselves, it's important that we are our number one priority, but it's also important that we're still there to offer love and support to the people in our life. If we're still able to add to other people's lives while still building on ourselves and not allowing anyone to kind of affect us, we have to realize that that's productive. That's what it exactly means. And I feel like people kind of confuse this even when they're talking about relationships. When you are in a relationship, you're still your own person. You still have your own responsibility and own love that you have to give yourself. But now you're aiding to someone else's. You're still adding on to your life while still adding on to other people. And when the two of you are doing this, continuously, you're developing a better relationship for the both of you. You've now know yourself deeper, but you also know each other deeper, because you took so much more effort into it. You took it so much more seriously, in the sense now that you can have a better relationship. You can have a better overall experience, because you're aware of what's going on around you. Because you're aware of how you're making yourself feel, you can feel better for other people. And I feel like you become incapable of feeling for other people when you isolate yourself too much. And I think that's what people need to stop doing. I think people should not really force companionship, but I think they should be more open to it. They should have this idea that there is belief. You are the love in the world that you wish to see. And I feel like that's a great reason to believe it still exists. It is being more optimistic in that sense, is being more open to realize that you can experience this love. You can have these better relationships. Instead of putting yourself in solitude and always isolating yourself, maybe start looking for the better experiences. Maybe start valuing these things a bit deeper, so that way you can have better relationships, so that way you can have better connections. And I think that's what people need to start doing. That's definitely why it's so easy to cloud yourself in this world of isolation.